There's a line, I think it's from John Steinbeck, that talks about the difference between a monument and a milestone. A monument, he says, is an end point. It's something you build to say, I reached my destination, this is the final place, the thing happened here and I went no further. But a milestone says, this is where my feet were before I continued on my journey. I like that. It feels to me like Christians are milestone people, not so much monument people. That there are indeed important moments in our lives that we mark, and we may even have a rite of passage or something ritual to say, I reached this point. But they're never destinations, they're milestones, including the really big important moments in our shared life of faith, those sort of life passage moments. In our final session of Worship Wise this past Sunday, as we concluded our series, we took a look at 4 big life passage moments that might happen in anybody's life. Many of them, some people experience all of them, a lot of people do. But we talked about each of them as milestones, and we also talked importantly about how in each of these moments, holy baptism, confirmation, marriage, and funeral or burial of the dead, each of these are moments where it's worth paying attention to the direction of the arrow, so to speak. From God to us, from us to God, from us to each other. What's actually happening here? So here's the short version of what we said. At holy baptism, especially for us Lutheran Christians, but grounded in the way the New Testament talks, the emphasis is not on something we do for God. The arrow is not so much us up to God, saying, look, God, we're doing this ritual that involves water, aren't you impressed? But rather God's promise that comes down, so to speak. Okay, we know God doesn't live up, but our way of thinking about God being beyond us comes from God to us. That at baptism, this is primarily about God's claim spoken to us, saying, you're my beloved, you're my child, I've marked you with the cross of Christ, you are claimed and belong. Everybody else gathered around the waters, the parents and baptismal sponsors and the whole congregation, we have a yes to say also, but it's always secondary and way smaller compared to God's yes, right? Holy baptism is this public moment, like an adoption, like the birth of a child, where God, from God's vantage point, God says yes to you, to me, and where we're marked with the sign of the cross on our forehead as this invisible sign that we belong, that we've been claimed, that we've been incorporated into God's found family of beloveds. That idea then carries over when we talk about the next big milestone of faith, that next life passage we sometimes call confirmation, which is also really also best understood as affirmation of baptism. It's a way of saying yes to the God who's first said yes to you. So if I'm an infant and I was baptized and I don't even remember it happening or understand what happened, that's appropriate, right? God's claim, God's the primary actor. God knows what God is doing. So when God says yes to me at the waters, it's all on God. But at some point, as I grow up, I want to continue to be in relationship with the God who's already brought me into relationship with God in the first place. I want to continue in the family that God has birthed me into or adopted me into. So when we talk about confirmation, again, it's less about I have to do this ritual so that God will like me or accept me, but more the God who's already said yes to me. I've come to a point, having learned important things about the faith, having come to think about it and believe it for myself, say yes back to God. So you might say the arrow is me up to God, so to speak, but always remembering that's the second act of a story that already began with God saying yes to me at the waters of baptism. So far, so good, right? The next major life passage we talked about is marriage, when two people say yes to each other. In an important way, marriage is kind of different from some of these other rites of passage we've talked about. One, it's not something that every Christian necessarily will do. It's not something that's unique to Christians. Plenty of other people in the wide world outside of Christianity marry and are given in marriage, right? So this is not something we have a corner on the market for. For us as Christians, marriage is still very much about two people making promises to each other. And in that wider context, we invite all their friends and family and all the guests and even God. We ask for their support and for their blessing. So is a marriage ceremony held in a church any more likely to survive and thrive and grow and last? No, that's not how it works. It's not magic, right? It's not, oh, you had your marriage service in a church, therefore your marriage is definitely solid, but anybody who went to the justice of the peace, you're on your own. No, living out a marriage starts with the promises, the vows that the couple makes, but very much it's about that day by day living out of those promises. It depends on both of them to do what they say they're going to do, to be there for each other. It's certainly appropriate to ask God, we would love you to bless this relationship. To ask all the friends and family, will you help support and help this couple to thrive and to grow and make them able to live out the promises they've made for each other. But this is an important difference. It's different from, say, baptism, where we say all the work, all the heavy lifting is God's to do. Marriage feels different. It's worth saying that out loud. Then the last milestone we talked about is a funeral or burial of the dead, which again, for us as Lutheran Christians, not unique, but certainly an emphasis for us, is how even at death, the promises spoken at baptism come back as a reminder God's love doesn't let go of us. So even in death, the emphasis is on this joyful, peaceful, graceful promise that God's love does not let go of us, that resurrection is the last word, that even at death, God says no to death getting a last word and yes to holding on to us forever. So there's a number of important moments in our pattern of worship and our liturgy at a funeral that are meant to call back to the waters of baptism. One of them is that physically we often start our funeral service here by the font and then process forward as a way of remembering this is where our life of faith begins, as God's promises spoken to us. So that even at death, the thing that I hold on to isn't, did I live a good enough life? Did I do enough good things? Did I give enough to the church or pray hard enough? But God's promise spoken over me that's made public at the waters of baptism. We also often will drape the casket in this white cloth called a pall that's meant to sort of echo the white garment that many of us are wrapped in at our baptism, whether it's literally the baptismal little outfit that your family dresses you in at your baptism, or in our congregation, many who are baptized are given a baptismal blanket that's knitted or crocheted by members of the family. And it's meant to symbolize sort of being wrapped up in God's love and clothed in Christ, so that when God looks at me all my life long, God doesn't see, so to speak, my mess-ups or my failures, but God sees Christ. God looks at me and sees Christ in me. So that even at death, I don't have to look back and go, was I a good enough dresser? Was I wealthy enough? What was my status? Did I look respectable enough? We're clothed in Christ, even to the end. And then there's this moment that is worth holding on to as well toward the end of our funeral at the cemetery committal service, where as a handful of soil is sprinkled over the top of the casket, and those ancient scriptural words about earth to earth, dust to dust, ashes to ashes are spoken. The sign of the cross is traced again in that handful of dirt right over the forehead of the person in the casket as a way of saying, even when death has done its worst, the claim of Christ still holds on to us. God's promise made public in baptism still lasts. We face even death itself with confidence and joy that's grounded in God's promise, so that we aren't left looking at the end of life going, I wonder if I was good enough, but rather God made a promise. And God's promise is, regardless of my goodness, badness, my permanent record, God's promise is to hold on to me and not to let death get the last word. So in a sense, all of our lives of faith, from the everyday, ordinary Sunday gatherings for worship to those important milestones along the way, are grounded in promises, and most of them are about God's promise to us. The most we can ever do back is to say yes to the God who's already said yes to us. So this concludes our series on Worship Wise, but I imagine somewhere down the road we're going to be having other conversations in other ways about what happens in worship, why we do what we do. If you have other questions or things you want to bring, please let us know. Remember, this coming Sunday, the 22nd of February, we're not having an adult forum because we're having our farewell for Vicar Natalie with a single worship service at 9 o'clock, and afterwards a breakfast for everybody to help say their farewells and wish Godspeed to Vicar Natalie. And then starting in the new month, we'll have new adventures to catch up with here. See you along the way.